So students had just finished up listening to a read aloud of the story Ralph Tells a Story, and they broke up into groups. So the video is beginning with me touching base with one of the groups. All right, guys, were you able to come up with some ideas?
Yes.
Right. How about on the theme? Were you able to come up and determine maybe what one of the themes might be?
Never give up.
Never give up. Okay, that is a theme that we could reinforce with details from the text. Any other ideas on what a theme might be of the story?
Anyone can write a story.
Yeah, anyone can write a story. So that kind of leads us into anyone can write a story because stories are everywhere, even in the small moments in our life. Did you think of any details from the text to support the theme that stories are everywhere?
There were people writing stories about their visit to the park.
Yeah, Ralph wrote a story about his visit to the park and when he found an inchworm. And again, that's just maybe a typical day for him. It wasn't anything exciting or super surprising that he went to the park. It was just, a small moment for him. All right, keep up the good work. I'm going to go touch base with some other groups. And in just a few minutes, we're going to come back for a full group discussion. Okay, so students would have finished up their group work. They would have had about 15, 20 minutes or so, and now we're coming back for a full group discussion. All right, great job, guys. You did a really great job working on your outlines. You had some great ideas that I was able to talk to you about when I was walking around. So, who wants to get us started by summarizing the story? You can start us off by telling us what was the name of the story, the title, and then go and start summarizing.
Ralph Tells a Story.
All right, the title was Ralph Tells a Story.
He was struggling to come up with ideas, and one of his classmates helped him.
Right, so at the beginning of the story, Ralph could just not write a story, even though all of his friends were and classmates were writing stories. He just couldn't think of anything to write about. So the next thing was he talked to Daisy, and Daisy helped him realize that stories are everywhere. So to continue the summarizing, what happened? What happened after he talked to Daisy?
He kept getting distracted and trying to leave the class, so he didn't have to write any.
Right. And how did the story conclude? What happened at the end?
He realized that stories are everywhere in his life, and he wrote a book of them.
Yeah, Ralph started writing stories. So he was originally able to come up with the idea of telling the story of when he found an inchworm at the park. And then once he was able to do that, he realized how easy it is to find stories in all moments of his life. Excellent job. So the next element that you had to work on your worksheet was the setting. There's two settings in this story, so we got to make sure we get them correct. Who wants to get us started by telling us the setting of the story we read?
Ralph being at school.
Yes, the setting was at Ralph's school, more specifically in his classroom. What about the setting of the story Ralph ended up writing and that telling to his classmates?
At the park.
Oh, yeah, yep, so that setting was at the park. All right, so next on to character. Who is the main character of this story?
Ralph.
Ralph, good job. Were you guys able to come up with any character traits?
He was determined.
He was determined. Do you have any evidence from the text to support it?
Even though he was struggling to come up with stories and he thought he couldn't, he ended up coming up with a lot of ideas.
Right, so he's determined because he didn't give up. He couldn't come up with ideas, but he kept working, and now he writes stories all the time. Was any other groups able to come up with another character trait?
He was distracted.
Distracted. That's a very good character trait. What were some details from the text that made you characterize Ralph as distracted?
Because he kept leaving class.
Kept leaving class. Right, he was going to the drinking fountain. He was going to the bathroom. So yeah, he just kept trying to read or leave class. There was maybe one more character trait. Did anyone? I heard one of the groups mentioning it when we were walking around.
He was confident.
Confident, yeah. And what was your specific text evidence to support that character trait?
Once at first he wasn't, but when he started coming up with ideas, he was able to write lots of stories.
Right, he was able to, once he wrote that first story, he was confident in his ability and he wrote a whole bunch of stories. Fantastic job. Those are really good character traits. You guys have a very good range of different ideas. So the last element I want to focus on, and kind of what we have been talking about throughout the whole class, was the theme. Who wants to explain the theme to the class?
There's stories everywhere, even in small ones.
Yes. So the theme that we really wanted to focus on from this text was that stories are everywhere, even in the small moments of our lives. Can anyone provide, there's a lot of details from the text to support this theme. Who wants to get us started?
Daisy wrote stories about Ralph in class.
She did. Daisy wrote a bunch of stories about Ralph, and he didn't even know it. Do you remember any of the stories she wrote about Ralph?
And painting his nails with marker.
So he painted his nails with marker. Any other stories?
He knocked down the crayons.
Knocked down the crayons.
And she wrote one about him brushing his hair.
Right, she wrote a story about him brushing his hair. So something about that's similar about all those stories is those are just small moments that happened in maybe one portion of their school day. You know, it wasn't even a full day of school. That was just a small moment that Daisy focused on and was able to write a story about. Any other evidence from the text to support the theme that stories are everywhere?
Someone wrote a story about being at their grandma's house.
Right, someone wrote a story. So in a more broad term, was Ralph's classmates were writing tons of stories about all different experiences. So Gage just mentioned someone wrote a story about being at grandma's house. Did anyone remember any other stories the class wrote about?
People going to the dentist.
Yeah, someone wrote about going to the dentist.
And getting ice cream.
Yeah, and they wrote about their mom chasing down the ice cream truck. Again, these are not very big and huge events in someone's life. Going to the dentist is a pretty, in a way, routine and boring experience. But the classmates were able to find a story in that small moment and extend it and share it with their class. What about Ralph? What was a specific detail or evidence from the text regarding Ralph that supports the theme that stories are everywhere?
He went to the park and saw an inchworm and he wrote a story about it.
Right, and how does that reinforce the theme? Why does him just writing a story about being at the park one day reinforce the theme that stories are everywhere?
Because it was just something that he had seen.
Right, you know, he might go to the park quite a bit. It might not be something new and very surprising or exciting for him to go to the park. So he took that small moment and turned it into a story and was able to share it with his classmates. So I just wanted to kind of relate this theme back to our overall class. So if you guys think back to that original prompt, the one that when you get your ticket in the door, the first thing we did at class, you had to choose a prompt. There were 6 different prompts you could choose to write about, and you had to detail your experience and tell a story about your time in that place or that specific setting. How does this reinforce our theme we've been talking about? The theme that stories are everywhere.
Because everyone has different stories.
Right, everyone had chosen. That's a really good point. You all had chose almost different prompts. You know, some people might have chose the same thing to write about, but for the most part, you all chose a wide variety of options to write about, which reinforces that stories are everywhere. If we think about it in that way, we can realize that stories are everywhere because if they weren't, you all would have chosen the same prompt to write about. You know, we would have to look in such specific places to find stories that there really wouldn't be much difference in what people are writing about. So it's important to keep your eyes open and find the stories everywhere, even in the small moments in your life. I just want you guys to keep thinking about that as we continue on throughout the next few weeks of class. You guys are eventually going to be writing your own personal narrative. So your job is to start thinking about some personal experiences, again, small moments in your life that you might want to write about. All right, so students, we would wrap up the class discussion with a learning target assessment worksheet, and it would help me assess where the kids are in relation to the learning target.